Well, I think we all kind of know who he is. So this is John Root, our naturalist. I thank you so much for coming in. He did a program earlier and he was wonderful.
Thank you.
Very good. And I also want to thank the Friends of the Public Library for supporting this program, as well as the Mass Cultural Council. Bring all these great things for you, so hopefully we'll have some time for some Q&A after, and I think he brought some gifts. He's always generous. So welcome, John.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And I also want to thank the East Longmeadow Cultural Council in particular. You mentioned the Massachusetts Cultural Council, but also the East Longmeadow Cultural Council funded this event. And on we go.
Do you want me to turn the lights down? Or?
Why not? Why not? Yeah.
Is that too
Yeah.
dark?
Is that better? Yeah, much better. Okay. We acknowledge that we live on land that was managed and inhabited before European colonization. Please take a moment to find your location on the map and honor those whose land we now occupy. And you can find this map native-land.ca, the Canadian website. So this is what pollination is. When an insect, usually it's an insect, sometimes birds, moves from flower to flower, helping themselves to those floral rewards, the nectar or the pollen, and just accidentally happens to carry pollen on its body to the next flower, which then the stigma, if you remember from biology class, that thing in the middle, the pollen lands on the middle, on the top of that stigma, and then hopefully it fertilizes the egg. But let's look at this. Is much magnified. This is a color tinted electron micrograph, and isn't it cool to see? First, you're seeing different kinds of pollen, aren't you? Like, the pollinators aren't going to be able to, or they don't care what they're bringing. They're going to bring in all kinds of different species of pollen. And that's exactly what you're going to see on if you had an electron microscope. And look at that pollen tube germinating. But of course, the flower isn't going to allow anything but its own species to germinate. Isn't that interesting? I mean, plants are really smart. And or it's not going to allow it to go ahead and grow down. And by the way, this is the fastest growing cell in the plant kingdom. Is the pollen tube? It's a race to get down there to fertilize. Double fertilization, actually, fertilization of the egg. Most of our plants need pollinators to set seed. The rest are wind pollinated. And even those wind pollinated flowers can offer pollen to, like you see that bee on the maple flower. It's still a flower to visit and get something from. But look how important pollinators are. The one in the middle did not get any pollen from another flower. The one on the right got some pollen from the wind, but it was there was kind of a net that was constructed around it, so the pollinators didn't have access to it. So only the one on the left actually received pollen directly from a pollinator. You see how important that pollination is to farmers and to us. However, insects are in trouble. Their numbers are plummeting. They're calling it the bug apocalypse, and it's nothing to laugh at. It's really serious because we can't make. The entire ecosystem is dependent, not just our crops, but the entire ecosystem is dependent on insects. So this is what we need to do. We need to provide habitat, and most of this program you're going to watch this evening, or at home if you're at a different time, will be about providing habitat with native plants mostly. But let's look at these next three: avoiding synthetic pesticides and fertilizers, reduce the air, water, light, and noise pollution that negatively impacts insects, and control the spread of invasive species. Now the next two, reducing your carbon footprint and being an eco-activist, are great too, but they're more general things to do regardless of what your cause is, right? That would have to do with reducing your carbon, just being friendly to the environment in general. But if we're focusing on the pollinators, now, I want to give you an idea of how beautiful this is going to be, not just because it's the right thing to do, but because you want to do it, and it'll increase your property value. How's that for incentive? I mean, every tree that you plant, every shrub that's beautiful and that's attracting butterflies and all that, you're going to be adding. It'll be a real improvement over just dull lawn and manicured shrubs and non-natives and all that. So let's say no to neonics. Do you see that word nicotine right in the middle of neonicotinoids? That says it all. And these are very, very harmful to not only insects but birds as well. They should be banned immediately, and they already are banned in Europe. So please don't, be aware of these products and just stay away from all insecticides in general if you can. Spraying for mosquitoes doesn't work. And of course, it's going to affect everyone else's property in addition to yours if you're hiring this person. Caterpillars are extremely sensitive. Bumblebees, other native bees, more sensitive than honeybees are. And here's what to do instead if you want to deal with mosquitoes. You set a trap for them, a bucket of water with a bunch of leaves down below that are going to, kind of get all decomposed. And so the mama mosquito, the female mosquito is going to sense, oh, this is a great place to lay my eggs. And she'll lay the eggs, the larvae hatch, and then if you put those mosquito dunks, which is a bacterium that will kill those larvae, then no mosquitoes. It's a mosquito trap. That's how you deal with mosquitoes. And if you want to go out there and garden and not have mosquitoes bother you, how about this? Any of the mints actually, or virtually any of the mints. All you have to do is rub the mint leaves on your skin, maybe 15 minutes worth of mosquito repellent at least, or you could make a spray and go on the internet. It'll tell you how to make a spray from mints and other plants. How about light pollution? We know that moths are attracted to flames are light, don't we? And that's it's unfair. It's just really cruel to them because they can't help it. That's their instinct. If you must use lights, how about lights that turn on when they're triggered? Or if it's going to be on for a long time, use yellow or orange lights, not incandescent. Now, it's important to be able to recognize and have a plan for how to remove or at least control invasive plants. Japanese knotweed, one of the big culprits, and it's very difficult to get. This is one case, by the way, where I would say using chemicals is justified. Careful application according to instructions, just once in July after you've done a preliminary cutting back, then come back in July and spray with what's it called, the one that is used on farmers' crops. Anyway, it'll come to me. Excuse me? No, the one that's used on GMO crops. Anyway, excuse me? Yeah, the Roundup is the brand name, but I'm forgetting the right. Yeah. Oriental bittersweet is a vine that will bring down trees. It's nefarious. It's terrible. Okay, so at least if you see these rope-like vines making their way up a tree, just cut them at the base so they can't make flowers and seeds, which they certainly will do if you let them. Multiflora rose has just sprung up everywhere. It's amazing how many of these plants were intentionally planted out of ignorance. Okay, multiflora rose, autumn olive is another one that makes its way around. It's thorny. It's nitrogen fixing, so it has a kind of advantage over the other plants. Bush honeysuckles, you see them all over. They're from Asia. The glossy buckthorn is a tree, very, very common in the woods. And burning bush, goutweed, garlic mustard, black swallowwort, and more. If you find at masslive.com, you can find a list of some 32 different plants. Just search for invasive plants in Massachusetts. So, native plants, what this presentation is all about. Why native plants? Why are they the best? Well, because native insects know what to do with native plants. Now, they often don't know what to do with non-native plants. For example, here are ornamental plants that have basically no pollinator value. And we see them a lot in our landscaping. And sure, they're pretty, but they're really just eye candy. They give something to us, but they don't give anything to pollinators. They just are fun to look at. But daylily, so we have way too much daylily. Hybrid tea rose, there's nothing there for pollinators. There's just a bunch of petals, right? Same thing for double marigold and petunia, New Guinea impatiens, begonia, peony, right? Forsythia. These plants have no value to pollinators whatsoever. In fact, even the dandelion, which some environmentalists think is such a great thing, it's not. It's a non-native. It's a allelopathic pollen means that the pollen that is brought to flowers of different species, because remember, pollinators sometimes bring, the pollen of the wrong species to that flower. If dandelion pollen is on a different plant, it'll bring down the seed production of that plant. It'll inhibit seed production. Isn't that plain dirty? And it also the pollen from dandelion only has 4 amino acids out of the 20-some that they need, so it's really kind of junk food for the pollinators. Yeah. Bees are the best pollinators. Why? Because their bodies are hairy, kind of. The pollen sticks to them, and they are actively gathering pollen and nectar. So, the honeybee, which is non-native, by the way, it was brought here by the Brits about 4 centuries ago, is the one that we know best. But there are about 400 different species of native bees, big ones, little ones, and in between, here in Massachusetts and in New England. So let's think about the honeybees. We certainly wouldn't want to see them gone, would we? They're our most important crop pollinator. Most honeybees you see belong to someone. We can think of them. We can think of them as a crop, or rather as a herding or herded animal, because they're coming back to the hive where they started out. And so when people are championing bees, they're usually thinking about the honeybee, which is understandable. Saving the bees is, well, how much trouble are they in? It does seem that their numbers, it's becoming more and more challenging for them to survive. Now, this doesn't mean that the bees are going to be, there's a lot of research that's done, there's a lot of money that goes into helping honeybees, and that doesn't mean that if well, like last year, 48% were lost, that doesn't mean that the other 48 will leave you with just a sliver, because what beekeepers do is they boost their numbers, they recreate their hives, they split the hives, or they can buy bees or whatever, queen bees or whatever. But still, it's at considerable expense, and it's an uphill battle in some ways if the environment is not conducive to either honeybees or native bees. Planting thyme is something that we can do for honeybees. They fan their wings over the thyme, and that helps to helps to get rid of the varroa mites that are such a problem. Those varroa mites that live on the bodies of honeybees and have such an effect on their health. And they just love the nectar from the thyme flowers as well. So thyme is a non-native, and honeybees are non-native, but that's okay. That's part of our environment now. Honeybees can cause problems for native bees, however. For example, they compete with native bees for nectar. They'll actually, they're like bullies. They pollinate non-native and invasive plants, and that's a problem because we don't want those plants to be pollinated and encouraged. And they can carry and spread viral diseases to our native plants. So let's talk about some of those native bees. For example, bumblebees. That's probably the one that you're most familiar with. There are many species of bumblebees, and you can even pet a bumblebee. The only time that a bumblebee is going to sting you is if you're being obviously, nasty or, unfriendly to it, right? Threatening its hive, for example. They are hive animals. Here are some of the bumblebee pollinated crops. So they are certainly important economically to farmers. Sometimes farmers even raise bumblebees and have bumblebee hives, for example, in tomato greenhouses, very good at pollinating tomatoes and anything in that family, such as peppers and potatoes and you name it. There's some wildflowers that can only be pollinated by bumblebees. For example, this bottle gentian, which never opens, a flower that never opens. So only a bumblebee can force its way into it. And only a bumblebee can crawl into these turtlehead flowers. It's kind of funny to watch the flower moving with a bee inside it and struggling to find its way out. But so here's the queen. That she has to start her hive from scratch every spring. She has to find a good place that's protected, and she can't create a nest, so she has to find a place that's already where a nest is already settled, maybe an old mouse nest or something like that. And she starts to lay her eggs, and she has to. And when those eggs hatch, well, she has to provision all her young plus the whatever needs she herself has to the energy needs and to keep going. So only once those new bees start to help her out with the hive, then she can devote herself to just laying more eggs. But until that happens, it's all up to her. So bumblebees need bedding and protection. Here are three possibilities. An old bird nest, inside a birdhouse. That can be a bumblebee house. Tree cavities are another place, or a ground nest, maybe under your tool shed, or any place where they can find this sheltered, they can use. Here's a guy, Dr. Rob Jagir, UMass Dartmouth. He knows about bumblebees. Oh my gosh. You know, there aren't many people out there who are studying native bees, but Rob is the guy. And he has an app called Beecology, and he'll help you, and he'll help you help him and help the rest of us to determine which plants are the ones that bumblebees are using, especially what he's interested in, they're at-risk bumblebees, right? So you'll see that the ones, the red is the more recent. So if the red is much lower than the blue, well, you know that that they have declined significantly. But some actually, look at that on the lower right, Bombus impatiens. There are many more of them now than there used to be. And same, right? So there are many more, both at low elevation and high elevation, than there used to be. Same is true for this one here. So Graciocollis. So here are the abundant ones, the two-spotted and the common eastern. But here are the ones that are at risk, the yellow-banded, the half-black, the golden northern. Those are the ones we really need to help. And here's what Rob Jagir is asking us to plant. For the short and medium tongue species, how about the bonesets, asters, milkweeds, goldenrods? Common buttonbush is a shrub that does well in wet places, but it'll do okay in a normal situation as well, just as long as it's getting enough moisture. The bush honeysuckle, now this is the native honeysuckle we're talking about. Dogbane is another one. Bee balm is a wonderful plant. And blue lobelia. Here's some more that he's asking us to plant. Turtlehead, obedient plant, spiked lobelia, monkey flower, oldfield toadflax, swamp or pasture thistle. This is the native thistle. There's a non-native that's out there, much more common. Purple giant hyssop, wild yellow indigo, blue flag iris. Now this is a native iris, and jewelweed is an annual that's quite common in wet places. All the rest are perennials, but jewelweed is an annual. And then there's St. John's worts. There's shrubby varieties and herbaceous. Carolina rose, now that looks very different. And the Virginia rose, these two look very different from your tea rose, they call it, with the multiple petals. And this is a real flower that the pollinator can do something with. Joe Pyeweed, it can be quite tall, 6 feet at least. Meadow sweets it looks like a wildflower, but it's actually a shrub. Boneset is another one that's quite tall, kind of like the Joe Pyeweed. Willows are a tree of various heights. There are different kinds of willows. And again, goldenrods and raspberry. This is a purple flowering raspberry. Grows in the margins of woods. Now let's consider some of the other bees in it's called the apids, the apidae. Besides the bumblebee and the honeybee, which are in this family, there are other representatives, other ones that are related to them. The digger bee, large carpenter bee, small carpenter bee, longhorn bee, cuckoo bee, and squash bee. Incidentally, a cuckoo bee does not know how to take care of its own young. It's a parasite on other kinds of bees. That's why it's called a cuckoo bee, like the cuckoo bird, right? Squash bee depends absolutely on squash flowers. It can't. It's obligate on squash flowers. The mining bees is another family of bees. Fairly small, often bandidy, usually dark-colored, solitary ground nesters. They resemble honeybees or wasps, but they're not. And they're harmless. A lot of bees are harmless. In fact, all the bees that are solitary are harmless. Here's our examples of andrenid bees pollinating spring beauty. All these are different species using the same wildflower that can be found in the woods. But here's one, the spring beauty bee, that can only use this flower. That's called oligolecty, when a bee is limited to one particular flower or one genus. The sweat bees are often colorful. They're small. They have short tongues. They're not aggressive because they're solitary. Sometimes they're called sweat bees because they're attracted to perspiration. Ground nesting, right? And 70% of our bees are ground nesting, and they are generalists. These are amazing bees. The female is actually able to dig these holes and then line them with this stuff that kind of, functionally it's like a plastic bag in there for the egg to grow up and then it leaves it eats its way out of its plastic bag in the spring and carries on with its life. The cellophane bees. So for these ground nesting bees, you can plant grasses and give them habitat. Bees can drill their holes or dig their holes underneath the grasses, or you can actually just create like a sandbox with 50% soil, 50% sand would be a good mixture. They like fairly sandy soil. Several yards across maybe, loose, well-drained soil, flat areas or earthen banks work well. The megachilid bees are different. Stout bodies, large mouth parts, usually dark colored. They carry pollen under their abdomen, and they are cavity nesters. They do not burrow into the soil. They have to find some place like a hollow stalk or the cavity of a piece of wood or something where they are going to deposit their eggs and have their brood chambers. The females need to find these places. The blue orchard mason bee, orchardists love this bee because they are much more efficient pollinating their flowers, the flowers of the fruit trees, than honeybees are. And that's why it's called a mason bee, because it actually plugs its brood chamber with mud. It finds mud, and makes that brood chamber. There's the wall of the brood chamber, and then lays some more. It's called bee bread when she adds pollen and nectar, mixes it together in that chamber, lays an egg right on it, and then seals off that chamber and keeps. Sometimes there will be like a dozen or more chambers in a single flower stalk, a single empty stalk. And if you've ever seen these perfectly perforated, this looks like somebody used a hole puncher on the margin of the leaf, right? And you can see that's how this is, again, the female that knows how to do this, to cut these almost perfectly circular pieces of leaf and then roll them up and inserting that into the cavity where that bee bread and the egg the egg's going to be laid on the bee bread, and then wrapping it up with that piece of leaf and then proceed just the same way, and until that stalk is filled up. So if you ever see these leaves, you can celebrate. Instead of being worried about your plant, you can be proud of yourself that you're actually providing habitat for leafcutter bees. And the plants are going to be perfectly fine, even though some of these look like they've been, the individual leaves might have been pretty well decimated, but the plant as a whole is not going to suffer. Sometimes people like to make bee hotels. If you do, I'm counting on you, I'm begging you to be well informed about what helps them and what does not, because sometimes we can love things to death. So, and bee hotels are, if you see advertisements for bee hotel and it has different insects like butterflies and ladybugs and stuff on it, that automatically tells you they don't know what they're talking about, right? It has to be for native bees, not for the other insects. Nothing is going to use pine cones, and right? And bamboo is the wrong kind of material to put in there. So again, please, ColinPurrington.com. Check him out. He's got a great, look at this, North Carolina State Extension. They need holes of different sizes, not all the same holes, because they're different sizes of native bees. And so in general, they range from 2 millimeters to 12.7 meters, which is roughly 1/8 to 1/2 inch. And here are some of the plants that will give these cavity nesters hollow stems, right? Where the females can lay their eggs. And look at all those in the sun aster family that are italicized and in green. And then you go to the now the italicized and green plants are mints. Okay, so there are a number of them. The aster family and the mint family are the majority of the plants on this page that you'll see that will provide those hollow stalks. Japanese knotweed, although it's an invasive plant, it's good for something. You can use it for bee hotels. Now, Heather Holm, PollinatorsNativePlants.com is her website. She explains that what you need to do in the spring, or rather in the winter, you leave the dead flower stalks. The reason you leave them is that birds might help themselves to the seeds, and that's something for them to eat. And then in the spring, you cut back the dead flower stalks, but you don't cut them to the ground. You cut them to 8 to 18 inches tall. And that way, some of those bees might find them and use them as their brood chambers. And then leave them. You never have to, I mean, the fresh vegetation will basically cover them up, so it won't look bad. And you never cut them at that point. Because and then the next spring, well, you cut back the dead stalks again, and proceed in the same manner. It's important to know that some bees travel farther than others. Honeybees are the champs. They can go as far as 7 miles from their hives, but many others, well, the bumblebee might be able to go a mile or so, but others not even close. The sweat bee, 300 feet is the average. And what that tells us is that we need to have a lot of pollinator habitat so that the sweat bees, for example, can find that pollinator garden. If you don't have a pollinator garden, if you don't have any sweat bees anywhere around, you can have a wonderful pollinator garden, but the sweat bees won't ever find it. So this is why this has to be a community effort. This shows it in a graphic way. Pollinator corridors is the concept of making sure that there's connectivity between all these different pollinator habitat gardens. Who would have thought that flies are pollinators? But after bees, they're the next best pollinators because they too have hairy bodies, and because there's so many of them, and because they like nectar and they help themselves to nectar. And we don't usually think of flies as being beneficial. We think of them as being nasty and pests and dirty and all that. But actually they are a great help to us, many of them, because the larvae of these flies can help control the pest insects. And in fact, there's this research being done in Australia. This is a raspberry leaf, I believe, a raspberry flower rather, that the fly is pollinating that flower. So here's a syrphid fly larva doing its job, taking care of, controlling the aphid population. So this is the immature, the larval stage of the syrphid fly. Now let's talk about wasps. Sometimes people call wasps bees, but there's a big difference. Bees are fuzzy and their legs are up when they're flying. Wasps are not so fuzzy and their legs dangle when they're in flight. And yellow jacket is the wasp that most of us know most and wish we didn't know when we step on a. I mean, this is the insect that you're most likely to get stung by, because it's easy to not know where that yellow jacket hive is in the ground and then just whoops. I guess I just learned where they are, right? And they can also rob honey. More social wasps, and you want to stay away from these hives as well, the bald-faced hornet and the paper wasp, because they will certainly vigorously defend their hives. But you have nothing to fear from the solitary wasps, and they can be wonderfully exotic and colorful and just really intriguing. They can also really help farmers because they too are controlling pest populations. Amazing what nature can come up with, right? All these different kinds of wasps. And then there's the beetles. The beetles were the original pollinators back in the day when flowers were a new thing, millions of years ago. How about the butterflies and the moths? They are different. Butterflies have simple antennae, while the moth's antennae are feathery. Usually butterflies are active in the day while moths are active at night. Usually butterflies are more colorful than moths as well. And here are the families of butterflies. The swallowtails are the ones that are really often the most, the largest and the most just impressive, right? But the brushfoots are also can get pretty big and are quite beautiful. The monarch is an example of one of those brushfoots. If you look closely, by the way, you'll notice that monarchs are walking around on 4 legs, not on 6. And all insects have 6 legs, right? Well, not the brushfoots, because that front pair of legs has gotten modified and is just used as a sense organ. But they can walk around perfectly well on 2 pairs of legs. And they are amazing how it takes several generations for monarchs to make that their legendary migration down to Mexico and back, whether it's on the East Coast population or the West Coast. They use the sun, they use the Earth's magnetic field to navigate. The metamorphosis, both parts of the metamorphosis, in other words, the caterpillar forming its chrysalis and then the butterfly emerging from it, involve a shedding of a skin. So there are two sheddings that happen to make this whole change from egg to larva to butterfly, and then to cycle through. You might be aware that milkweeds must have, rather monarchs must have milkweeds because only milkweeds will feed those voracious caterpillars. And there's more than one species. As a matter of fact, you don't want to use the common milkweed in your garden. It's much too aggressive. It's kind of like a thug in your garden. It'll go everywhere, and it'll be impossible to contain it. So I would suggest instead that you use swamp milkweed that can handle wet places. Butterfly can handle dry places. Pokeweed can handle shade. All of them can grow in a normal setting with partial shade, and they're much more well-behaved than the common milkweed. However, be aware of this invasive vine called the black swallowwort, because the female monarch might go ahead and lay her eggs on the leaf. It's closely related to these milkweeds, but that would be a fatal mistake because the egg, when it hatches, the caterpillar will not be able to feed on and nourish itself on the leaves of the black swallowwort. So please rid your property of this plant if at all possible. And let's consider what kinds of leaves different butterflies require. Eastern tiger has these, the cute butterfly, the larva rather, the caterpillar with its fake eyes it's amazing what nature does, right? It's all about intimidating the predator to have fake eyes, right? So willow, wild cherry, birch, and ash are all hosts for the eastern tiger. Spice bush and sassafras, the only two possible leaves that spice bush swallowtail caterpillar can eat. And black swallow's hot tail, anything from the carrot family, which includes golden alexanders and Queen Anne's lace. Morning cloak caterpillars need willows, poplars, or elms to grow into adult butterflies. Baltimore checker spot can feed on turtlehead and plantain as a caterpillar. Spring azure can use flowering dogwood, viburnums, and blueberry. But the moths often are much more generalists. The Eo moth, that beautiful moth that you see there with the impressive fake eyes to scare off the predators. That's a long list of trees, right? Another long list of trees for this. Similarly, now we've got two sets of eyes looking at us, right? The polyphemus moth. Many trees are useful as host plants. Likewise for the Luna moth. And the Cecropia moth. You wouldn't believe that there really could be such a caterpillar unless you saw a photograph of it, right? Looks like somebody's imagination. And perhaps you've seen the clearwings or the hummingbird moths, they're sometimes called. They look like hummingbirds. They behave like hummingbirds. They're large and they hover over flowers. Host plants include viburnums, honeysuckles, blueberries, and anything in the rose family. And there are a lot of plants in the rose family. Doug Tallamy is a guy who's gotten a lot of attention. Bringing Nature Home is the book that he wrote that really inspired people. And he's very passionate about asking us, please plant native plants because those are the plants that those native caterpillars need. Caterpillars simply cannot eat the leaves of non-native plants. It's all about the appropriate vegetation, the appropriate diet. And he's suggesting that we think of our properties as part of one large homegrown national park. So the best plant, bar none, as far as hosts, attracting 534 species of caterpillar and butterfly, excuse me, moth and butterfly caterpillars, is the oak. But pretty close to it is the black cherry. And when you think about how there are probably plenty of oaks around, maybe it's more important to plant black cherries to make sure those caterpillars have something to eat. And the same goes for willow. In fact, willow, in addition to being a great host plant, also nourishes 14 different specialist bee species. So that makes it a keystone species, a really important plant, any of the willows. Birch is important as well, so is poplar as a food source for caterpillars, the crabapple, blueberry, and then doubly important again because the flowers nourish the specialist bees, in addition to the leaves being a good food source for the caterpillars. Maple, elm, pine, the list goes on now. I mean, there are more than just these. In fact, notice that pine attracts 203. It's a host plant for 203, but the number one herbaceous plant weighs in at 115, which is considerably less. However, that's a lot more than zero. And so caterpillar, and the fact that goldenrods attract 11 specialist bee species makes this a really important plant, any of the goldenrods. You don't want to plant the aggressive goldenrods on your property, the Canada goldenrod, for example, or the wrinkle-leaf goldenrod, or the giant goldenrod. They just will take over. They won't leave any room for the rest of your plants that you want to encourage. So make sure that you select the goldenrods that are more well-behaved when you're planting your garden. Asters are also really important in terms of late flowering nectar sources as well as host plants, both. Here's some more host plants, any of the native sunflowers, any of the rudbeckia. So that includes black-eyed Susan, brown-eyed Susan, and cutleaf coneflower. These are good host plants. So are the boneset on the left and the Joe Pye weed on the right. So are sedges, violets, wild geranium, wild strawberry. All these are native plants. Now let's talk about the New England's native trees that are good for pollinators because they have foliage. And you look at the map and find out where you are. If you go to nativeplanttrust.org, all you have to do is put in your zip code, and it'll tell you what your ecoregion is, and then you'll use that. And by the way, if you're going to plant a tree, 811, did you know you could dial 811 and someone will come for free and tell you where all your power lines and that sort of thing are, where you should not dig. You might want to think about protecting your sapling from hungry vegetarians during the winter, right? The deer and the rodents and all that. So here is the cast of characters, the native trees that are important for our native pollinators. Pussy willow, wonderful plant. Beautiful redbud. And remember this, those leafcutter bees can use it. Juneberry, one of my favorite trees. Those fruits are absolutely delicious, and the birds know it. In fact, you're lucky if you get to taste any of those Juneberries because they will, but I think they're just as tasty as blueberries, maybe even better. A little taste of almond in there because you can taste the seeds. So it's beautiful all year round. It's got the white flowers, it's got the fruits, and then in the fall foliage, absolutely gorgeous. Red maples are used by pollinators. So are oaks and hickories, even though they're wind pollinated. Anything in the rose family, though, all these fruit trees that have rose-like petals, rose-like flowers. And the crabapple is also in the rose family. So is the American plum. So is the hawthorn. Notice how the flowers are similar. They're five-petaled. They have a lot of stamens. More trees in the rose family. Okay, the sweetbabe magnolia is a primitive tree. Black gum, spectacular foliage in the fall. Likewise, the American mountain ash. Sassafras, I love its foliage as well. Basswood is also called linden, and honeybees love these flowers. You'll see honeybees just swarming over the flowers when they're in bloom. Any of the dogwoods are popular with bees, and they're popular with birds as well. American holly is an evergreen. Wintergreen is a deciduous holly. Oh, excuse me, winterberry holly is the deciduous holly. And half of them are male, half of them are female. Fringe tree is native to our area. And then there's the tulip tree, a tall, straight trunk that has flowers for the bees. And now it's time for the shrubs and canes to strut their stuff, okay? Beach plum can be a shrub. Black chokeberry, one of my absolute favorite shrubs. Those fruits are incredibly loaded with antioxidants. Nutritionally, they're just powerhouses for people as well as for birds, and they're good for pollinators as well. So it's a win-win, and beautiful in the fall. One of my favorite plants. Inkberry, purple flowering raspberry, the native roses that we saw before, the black raspberry, also in the rose family, blackberry, wild black currant does amazingly well in the shade. Elderberry does well in wet places, but can handle normal soil. And the elderberry pancakes are one of my favorite. That's how I use those elderberries. I put them in my pancake batter. But so, birds can eat the fruit. It's good for pollinators. Pollinators go for the blueberry flowers as well. And you couldn't ask for more beautiful fall foliage than in blueberries. Common ninebark, very popular. The pollinators just swarming over this shrub. But you don't want the variety that has purple leaves of anything. Nurseries will have purple leaf varieties of all kinds of different things. In general, number one, those plants are not as strong as they would be if they had green leaves because they're really not getting the full spectrum of light. And number two, they aren't going to nourish the native plants, the native insects rather, that depend on the green leaf varieties. All the viburnums are good for both pollinators and songbirds because they have the fruit in the fall. So a lot of times when you're doing the pollinators a good, a service, when you're providing for them, you're also providing for the songbirds. All of these are in the viburnum family. We've got quite a selection of different heights. Red osier dogwood, gray dogwood, round leaf dogwood, spice bush, sweet pepper bush. Butterflies absolutely love this shrub. Clethra alnifolia. It's good to learn Latin names, by the way. You can impress people, but also you'll just know more about what you're doing. You won't be confused about what the plant is. New Jersey tea. Meadowsweet, I mentioned earlier, it's not a flower, although it looks like a herbaceous. It's actually a shrub. And so is steeplebush. These are just beautiful in the landscape, and they're very attractive to pollinators. Staghorn sumac can be pretty aggressive, but it does have its wildlife value, and it is a native. Common witch hazel. Wild hydrangea, there is such a thing. There's a lot of non-native hydrangeas out there, but this is the wild native variety. Sweet fern can grow quite well in dry soils, dry sandy soils. And then we have our native honeysuckles, the dwarf bush honeysuckle and the American fly honeysuckle, and good old mountain laurel, which does well in the shade. And so does its younger cousin, the sheep laurel. And then there are azaleas and rhododendrons galore that are, usually when you go to a nursery, you'll see all kinds of cultivars that are not native. These are swamp azalea, pinkster bloom azalea, rose shell, and if we have plants like this, why would we ever need the cultivars, right? Rose Bay, buttonbush I mentioned. This is look at that gorgeous fall foliage, and this can grow quite well in wet places. American hazelnut. Good luck getting those nuts though, because squirrels love them too. Now, Kathy Neal has provided this flowering calendar for us. I think it's a wonderful resource because it'll show you what you need to, our goal is to have at least 3 plants blooming at all times. And our goal also is to have a lot of variety. And if you think in terms of both biodiversity and biomass. So biodiversity means you have a lot of different kinds of species. Biomass means you have a lot of each, a lot total leaves, a lot total flowers, right? So that's why trees and shrubs are so important, because the biomass, the number of leaves, the number of flowers is so impressive with trees and shrubs. But she's giving us this list of the herbaceous plants. If you're planting a wildflower garden, notice all the asters and goldenrods at the end of the year. And those first 6 species I have in my garden, or the first, and they have already bloomed. The golden Alexanders, wild columbine, wild lupin, Ohio spiderwort, blue wild indigo, and the foxglove beard tongue. So if you aim for having, all or most of these, so much the better. But at least try for 3 at a time, blooming in any given stretch of on the calendar, 3 at a time. Can lawns be pollinator friendly? The answer is yes, but not this kind of lawn where a lot of chemicals are applied and there just aren't anything. There's nothing but grass. The perfect lawn is the green carpet kind of lawn is, well, there's a lot of things wrong with it. Okay, I'm not even going to read this, but we should all be aware that for many reasons, lawns are a bad idea, and they really are a conceit, if you will. Back centuries ago, the aristocracy in Britain decided they would impress people, and they would have a lawn to prove that they didn't need to use that land for practical purposes. And they would hire people to make it manicured, right? We just have to stop. We just have to stop this madness. So, however, this is one way to do it. If you're going to have a lawn, why don't you invite the flowers that often will pop up if you don't put down those herbicides, right? You can even purposefully plant things like self-heal, which is the top middle plant, or this one right here, or violets, or wild strawberries. These are all native plants. And incidentally, Susanna Lehrman is the scientist, the scientist who proved that, and she did a study in Springfield, if you mow every other week, not every week, not every 3 weeks, but every other week is the best frequency. If you mow every other week, then these flowers have a chance to bloom, and she demonstrated there are 111 different species of pollinators that came and used them. But if you wait too long, the grass gets too long, and it's hard for the pollinators to find those flowers. So every other week is pretty much ideal. So if you have a place in the lawn that you want to transform into a garden, what to do? Smother it. I mean, sure, you could dig up the lawn, but that's a lot of work. So if you just smother it with cardboard and then put some mulch on top of that, that's all you need. If you're starting a vegetable garden, it's good to have some compost in there and enrich the soil. But if you're just going to be planting some wildflowers, you probably don't need the compost. There's probably enough fertility in the soil. If it's growing grass fine, then it'll probably grow those wildflowers fine as well. And the photo on the lower left, you'll see this stuff is called builder's paper, and you can buy it at big box stores. And so if you have a large area to cover, then you can use it, just roll it out and make sure that they're overlapping by several inches so the grass doesn't have a chance to work its way up between the edges, and then put down that compost, or rather the mulch. Compost can be mulch, by the way, but compost will also invite seeds to germinate. If any seeds are dropped on the compost, they'll be happily germinating right there, any weed seeds. So look at the perennial bed options. Shredded leaves, pine straw, or the pine needles is what I'm talking about there. Shredded pine bark is great, and sawdust. Now, wood chips are not so great for wildflowers. They're okay for the woody plants, like the shrubs and trees, but I would not use wood chips to do sheet mulching. I would use instead the shredded pine bark, or the chip branch wood, which is what happens when a chipper goes through and all the twigs and the leaves and all that, but not the wood. But do we need to buy any of the stuff? Well, hopefully you can be resourceful. People often put out their leaves, and if you ask them, can I have your leaves? They'll say, of course you can, right? You can often find places where leaves have been dumped and it becomes compost because they've been dumped there for so long. Or you could start your own, obviously, start your own compost pile. Or the more connections you have with people, the more you're able to make use of things that they don't need. Please don't use dyed mulch. It's often contaminated with things that are bad for plants. And let's talk about those early spring flowers. Remember, many of them have no value for pollinators, including the daffodils, forsythia, and tulips. Some of them do have some value, even though they're not native, such as these snowdrops, crocus. And don't forget, in the early spring, there's not much blooming. So I would say that, sure, go ahead and plant these non-natives. But here are some native plants that you can also use as part of your palette for planting your garden. Here's 8 more. Not all of these are native in our region, but they are native somewhere in not that far. And one of the things we can think about is that our region might be changing due to climate change. So some of the plants that have a range to the south of us, it might be helpful for us to introduce them to our range. You see a lot of Japanese pachysandra, you see a lot of periwinkle, and you see it in the woods, which means that it's spreading, and it shouldn't be. So instead, consider these as native ground covers up in high places, and in bearberry likes a lot of sun, can handle sandy soil. Pussy toes, 3-leaf cinquefoil. It's kind of evergreen in some ways, that beautiful foliage, and stays that way all winter. Golden star, or green and gold. It's not all that fast growing. Boy does it do a good job of covering the earth with foliage, and so does barren strawberry. So named because it doesn't create a strawberry, and notice how the flowers are yellow, not white. But the foliage does a good job. Coral bells in the shade, foam flower again in the shade, golden ragwort. It competes very well with that invasive, what's the name of it? Garlic mustard. Okay, it can compete well with garlic mustard. Wild ginger in the shade can tolerate quite dark shade. Wild geranium is shade tolerant as well. So is wild strawberry. How about hosta? That's not native. And there are other alternatives to it, right? The mayapple, wild ginger, goat spirit, and many more. Let's think about grasses and all the reasons why we might want to include them as well as the wildflowers. For their beauty, their drought resistance, providing habitat for ground nesting bees. They can be host plants, food for birds, overwintering habitat for eggs, caterpillars, and pupae. And here's some of my favorite grasses. Sedges are likewise useful for a variety of purposes. They do well in moist places often. You can even have a lawn of nothing but Pennsylvania sedge. And flowers for nectaring butterflies. Butterfly bush is non-native and potentially invasive, so I do not recommend it. Okay? Instead, purple coneflower, which actually is not native to our region, but it sure is enticing to the butterflies, and it's a useful plant in our landscapes. But please, if you do use it, avoid cultivars for the following reasons, okay? Less nutrition for pollinators, less genetic variation, more vulnerable to pests and diseases, may not be open pollinated or self-seed, less adapted to local soils and climate. It can be difficult to establish and maintain. It may distract pollinators from wild plants. They might hybridize with our native species, which affects their survivability. Compass plant is one of my favorites, and it gets really tall, like 8 feet, 9 feet. Blazing star, a beautiful flower that's attractive to butterflies. So all these are good ones for if you're really wanting to bring in the butterflies. Of course, it doesn't mean that only butterflies will come. They'll often be attracted to other insects as well. Goldenrods, boneset, milkweeds, high bush blueberry, wild bergamot. There it is again, Turk's cap lily. What a fantastic flower. So for butterfly gardening, you want sun, you want a source of water, you want shelter from the wind. Don't forget that you need to feed the caterpillars with their host plants, and of course the nectar-producing plants as well throughout the growing season, and use organic landscaping practices to protect them. Male butterflies need mud, and they can get it from a repurposed bird bath. If you put salt or compost in there with the gravel and sand and keep it moist, then all butterflies, or butterflies of some species at any rate, the males and females will often come visit rotting bananas and other fruit. They don't mind that it's rotting. Butterfly container gardening is an option to consider. And the larger the container, the less often you have to water it, and the more plants you can cram into it. Native Plant Trust is a great resource, both because there are 2 nurseries that sell plants, one in Framingham, one in Whately, and also because of their website. So the Native Plant Trust hosts this Go Botany tool. So I'm just giving here an example of all the different photos that you could find of golden Alexanders. That's one species, and you'll see all these different. You'll see the plant in all its different times of year and the different plant parts, and you'll see. You'll learn facts about it. You'll see where it's documented to be native. And if you go to Illinois Wildflowers, you'll see descriptions of the plant, the habitat, the cultivation, and especially the wildlife visitors. What is it that comes and makes use of this plant? For example, the golden Alexander's mining bee, or all of these. Okay, this is the kind of information that I don't see anywhere else except for the IllinoisWildflowers.info that shows you just how many insect visitors and which ones will come to those particular plants. Missouri Botanical Garden is another great resource on the web. It gives you a lot of practical information, such as the height and spread at maturity, when it will bloom, how much sun it needs, how much water it needs. Now, you might be aware that deer eat plants, so you don't want to give them something that you don't want to plant things that you're intending for pollinators, and then it's gone the next day. New England Wildflower Society, ipswichma.gov is one good source I found. And then the Cornell Cooperative Extension is another, ccecolumbiagreen.org. The same website will give you information about groundhog-resistant plants. And then for rabbits, try Penn State Extension. Think about planting health strips, which are that strip right along, between the sidewalk and the road where, yes, some salt will be thrown up. You'll have to deal with that, but many plants can tolerate that. That's why it's called a health strip, by the way, because of the supposedly inhospitable conditions. Wildflower meadows, consider it. If you have a large area that's currently in lawn, think about how you would make the transition, and there are a couple ways to do it. One is by just tilling maybe 2 or 3 times until the seed bank is exhausted and nothing's growing anymore. And then if you do that this year, you could distribute the seed. You could sow the seed in the fall, and that would come up next year. And you can get that seed locally at New England wetland plants. Oop, some repetition here. Oh, I'm going backwards, that's why. Okay, go forwards. Wildflower meadow establishment. This is another way, just putting out black plastic and smothering the lawn. Consider growing wildflowers from seed. You will sure have a lot of seed if you're doing things right, and a lot of plants, and they don't mind being so crowded in close quarters to start out, and then eventually, of course, you're going to have to separate them and give them enough room to grow. Many seeds require a period of cool and moist conditions, and your refrigerator is ideal. So if you put those seeds in a plastic bag with some vermiculite or strips of moistened paper towel or something like that for the required amount of time, and then bring it out and bring them out and then plant them in pots. You could put those pots outside, or you can keep them inside. But eventually you're going to have to get them in at least plug size, their own cells, if not they're in pots. You could always plant several in a pot, but just get them a little bit separated compared to what they were earlier. Another way to get a lot of plants is to break apart the clumps, because often each clump or each stem will have its own roots still attached. This is a photo that I took of some swamp milkweed clumps. That was one plant that started out, and I got 5 out of it. If you bury a stem, that stem will be convinced that it'll be safe to root, and then you can lop it off. It'll become a new plant. Cuttings are remarkably easy at times, especially if you add a plant hormone. So here's a list of plant nurseries, and I have in bold Nasami Farm Whately, Wing and a Prayer Nursery in Cummington, Triple Brook Farm in Southampton that are fairly near East Hampton. And earlier we were talking about a place in Enfield as well. So, and New England native plant seeds, I mentioned New England wetland plants as a good source for wildflower seeds. But if you're just looking for a particular species, I highly recommend the Wild Seed Project in Maine. They have a lot of selections and at reasonable prices. This is a great Facebook group to belong to, Native Plants of New England. You can get answers to all of your questions there about what it is that, what do I have growing here? Or what should I plant here? Or things like that. Befriend gardeners in your area. Collaborate, work together. Celebrate what you're doing. Many hands make light work. And the more people you know, the more plants you have access to, because you're sharing those plants. And the more children who are enjoying gardening, well, the better off we are, because all decisions must maximize the welfare of the unborn. We have to think about them, right? Unto the 7th generation. There is no limit to what we can do together. Start where you are, and thank you for doing your part. So if there are any questions, I'd be happy to attempt to answer them. Thank you.
Okay, I have a question.
Yes.
So going back to where there's one part of my lawn, not the front, but the back, that I want to turn that into a wildflower garden.
Okay.
So, and I know cover it with cardboard. I've been saving cardboard.
Yeah.
But is the best time to do that? I was thinking in the fall. So
Well,
I
if you do
cover
it
in
now,
the fall,
yeah, then you can plant things in the fall. And the fall is the best time for when you buy plugs or when you buy plants that are in pots, that's the best time. If you put them in the ground now, well, they might do okay if you're vigilant and if you're watering and if they survive the summer. But if you put them in the fall, they have time to get established, like late summer, early fall. They have time.
What about seeds?
Well, now the seeds, again, if you put the seeds in after you've killed the lawn and you're convinced that there is no, no grass and no seeds that are going to compete with it, New England wetland plants would it recommend fall sowing like October, and then in the spring those seeds will sprout and come up. Because what you're doing is you're giving them that experience of winter, which so many of those plants need. They need to be convinced that winter is over, right? So they won't just suddenly germinate.
Better to do it.
Yeah, they won't germinate. Yeah, so
Better to do it
yeah, it's great to do the sheet mulching now. But sheet mulching is something you can do really any month of the year, and then do the next step whenever you're ready.
I stopped fertilizing this spring, this section of my lawn, so it's had no fertilizer, it's just whatever was there. So I'm thinking that's better.
Okay.
Then put the cardboard
Yeah.
down.
Let's turn the light on, and I have some free plants here for anyone who wants to help themselves and go home with plants. I've got plastic bags. Also, put your name and email address down if you want me to send you either a link to the slides you just saw, just in case you want to see the slides again, and or if you want me to send you information about these plants, because I have a couple of sheets, a couple of plants with information about them, but the others I don't have the information hard copy, but I can send you, attachments with that information. So step right up and get your free plants.